Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Schweinberger, and I'm here to present another presentation that is part of the Language Technology and Data Analysis Laboratory LADAL Webinar Series 2021. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianships of the lands on which we meet. And we pay our respect to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We also recognize the valuable contributions to Australian and global society, and we're very proud that we can do what we do here in Australia with the support of the University of Queensland. If you want to know more about LADAL and the presentations that are part of the opening webinar series, you can find more information on the LADAL website. And you can also find more information about the talks on the website following the link that's listed below. If you want to be alerted to upcoming news or presentations, you can follow us on Twitter, or you can also contact us directly using the email address that's listed below. It's a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sam Hames. Sam is a developer/data scientist at the Digital Observatory, which is part of the Research Infrastructure Group of the Queensland University of Technology, QUT. He has a PhD under examination in machine learning for medical image analysis and a commercial background in software development for text analytics, algorithms, and products. At the Digital Observatory, Sam helps researchers deal with the challenges of collecting, modeling, and analyzing digital data. Sam is particularly interested in both the web as a medium and in the development of computationally assisted methods for bridging the qualitative and quantitative divide in the language sciences, but also beyond. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to introduce Sam, and I'll hand over to him.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak today. So let me just share my screen. I nearly forgot that. That's kind of important. So I'm going to be talking about social media and web as sources of data for research.
It's only me, but you just cut out. I'm very sorry. But now you're back. I just want to let you know. You might have to repeat what you just said.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'll be talking about using social media and web data as data for your research. We're on a video call hosted on the internet with an international audience during the middle of a pandemic, so I probably don't need to convince you that the internet is a big deal. It's kind of important. I don't think we would be able to function much without it. As Martin mentioned, I am part of QUT's Digital Observatory, so what I'm going to be talking about today is opinions, challenges, and questions that have come up in the work I've been doing across many different types of research with many different kinds of researchers in many different fields. So this talk is more to prompt some questions in yourself rather than to give definitive, specific black and white, you must do this kind of thing. It's a starting point for future questions. I'll also add that I'm not a linguist. I do enjoy working with linguists. Linguistic projects are really fun and I would like to do more of them, but I do a lot of research with lots of other people as well. So this isn't just going to be from a linguistic perspective. It's going to be from a bit from the web and the internet as fields or areas of research. Martin already talked about what we're doing with the Digital Observatory, but I'll just mention that apart from helping researchers directly with projects, as part of the Digital Observatory, we also look after a large-scale longitudinal collection. So some of what I'll be talking about is my experiences maintaining the Australian Twitter sphere, or the questions around giving researchers access to data in a longitudinal Twitter collection. So that Twitter collection is currently more than 1 million tweets a day from over 1 million accounts identified as Australian. So there are a lot of challenges with managing and giving access to that research. And some of what I'll tell you today, talk about or prompt today is the challenges we've run into with trying to manage that and make sense of that, and how do we handle this data responsibly and appropriately on behalf of other researchers. So there's my email address and our group's email address, which will be at the end. So before I kind of dive in, I want to just give a few working definitions, which I'll probably undercut myself later by using interchangeably. But when I say the internet, I am talking about the hardware and software underpinning the internet as a network of networks, or the technology that allows my machine here to get from my network over a wireless connection across the world to wherever your machine is, and all of the hardware and software that's required to make that happen, whether it's the physical cables, the routers, the switches, and the software layers built on top of that. My working definition of the web is anything you can see in a browser, which is probably not perfectly accurate, but good enough for most purposes. And when I talk about social media platforms, I am talking about sites like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Tumblr, some others that are just completely evading me at the moment because there's lots of them, but also things like forum softwares and smaller scale things as well. So when I'm talking about social media platforms, I'm usually talking about, or usually these are platforms that build on top of the web. So they're another layer up the stack again. So I want to start with kind of a few questions and challenges and things that I think everybody working with data from the internet or the web and social media in particular should think about, or at least have some thoughts about before we dive into projects, because it's a really complicated space. There's no definitive guidelines in most cases. And depending on where you are in the world, there'll be very different frameworks and approaches today. Some of what I'm going to say today is specific to the Australian context, because that is the context and I know. And if you ask me about other places in the world, I won't be able to answer because I don't know. But I'm talking really about what should we think about before we begin a project, or at the beginning of a project when we're looking at the web, or where we want to source data from social media or related things. And if you take away nothing else from this talk, I would like you to remember that just because something is technically possible, like you can visit something on a website and see some data or something that people have shared, doesn't mean that it's a good idea for you to just grab it and use it for your research. I think as responsible researchers, we need to be prepared to think just that little, we need to do a bit more work to make sure that what we're doing is not going to cause harm to other people or to ourselves, and to make sure that we have a framework in place for managing at least some of the risks as much as we can foresee. And probably one of the biggest ones when we're talking about social media research in particular is, how do we manage privacy? How do we manage ethics? And how do we manage consent? Because when it comes to studying what people are posting on social media, what is being posted on social media is being posted by people, that is humans. And if we aren't careful, we can lose sight of the fact that we are doing research into humans and research about humans. And sometimes the research we do can have impacts on those humans that we need, and we need to manage that. We need to be prepared to deal with that. We need to be prepared to minimize the harm to people, and we need to be prepared to at least think about some of these issues. And the biggest problem in the context of privacy is that most of the time people do not understand, just because some content is available on the web does not mean that people understand or expect that that content is just going to be used by anyone. Most people don't. If somebody posts on Twitter, for example, they make a tweet, their usual expectation of the audience of that tweet is that someone is just that tweet is only going to be seen by the people in their followers. Maybe it's a small, well-crafted audience, or they have a specific audience of peers or something like that in mind. Most people don't post to social media with the mindset that a researcher could read this and could use it for some purpose. And in some cases, it could be that if they did have that in mind, they may change their behavior or change their actions. So we need to be careful in managing how we approach that. I will also say in many cases that sometimes consent is literally impossible to capture. Whether it's a technical thing, like you may just not have the ability to contact users to ask for consent, or even if you do have the technical capability, there may be some reason that they have no way to actively consent. So in Australia, a lot of research in this space takes place under a waiver of consent, which acknowledges that and allows some research to continue. But we need to keep in mind that we have not asked the people who are generally the participants in this research to consent. They haven't made an active decision to be involved in it. They've just often posted something that matches a search query, and here they are in a data set. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that just because we're assuming that they had consented or we don't think they'd have any reason to object doesn't mean that they wouldn't object. And if they find out about it later, it can have an impact on them to think of researchers viewing their tweets. And that can be particularly important when we're talking about more sensitive groups. So if somebody is talking about being sexually assaulted online, that's a very sensitive topic. And if they've posted that in the expectation that it's a small audience and they're looking for support, and then later on a researcher comes along and uses that, whatever they've posted in a research context, they may feel that that infringes on their privacy. They may feel that researchers are surveilling them, and that may impact their behavior or their ability to access their support networks. Because the flip side of everything that I'm talking about here is that the internet is important. It's an important social outlet. It's an important place for people to gather. It's an important place for people to find friends, to find like-minded people, to find support. So we need to be careful of the context in which we're operating. Now, for most projects, the subject matter or the people in question, it's not a particularly sensitive issue. Like if you're looking at something about people talking about their sports teams, maybe that's not such a big deal. But we do need to keep in mind that it can be an issue, and we need to be prepared to accept that sometimes some things may not be worth, well, we should not take the risk of researching, or we need to have some better framework in place, and we can't just grab what we want because it happens to be public on the internet. The next thing we need to consider, and I say consider because there's a lot of caveats and asterisks of this, and a lot of context-dependent things here. Particularly when we're talking social media platforms, those social media platforms are governed by terms of service. So if Facebook says you can do these things on the platform, you cannot do these things. Twitter says a different set of things. And what the terms of service will be will depend a bit on, like, are you signing up for an account and using the platform as a user? Are you accessing it through a developer API? Are you just visiting the public site without logging in your web browser? Those all have different connotations and potential implications. Not that anybody will be able to put in black and white terms exactly what might happen or what risk you're facing, but I think you should be aware of what the terms of service are. I'm not saying necessarily that in every case the terms of service are something you need to follow, particularly when we're talking about platforms like Facebook, where that are openly antagonistic to independent researchers, and the terms of service are constructed in a way to limit visibility into platforms. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that the terms of service are for the platforms. They are not necessarily for the users. They are not necessarily for the researchers. I just want to remind people that the terms of service exist. If the terms of service say you can't do something and then you do that thing, that may have implications for your project. It may not. But you do need to be aware of what they are and where the lines are, and understand if you're going to cross them, why are you going to cross them? What is the public benefit of me crossing that? Is it worth the risk of Facebook sending me a cease and desist about some application I'm building? Which is not a hypothetical, as some researchers at NYU are currently dealing with. The next thing is copyright, which again will vary a bit depending on the platforms, but in general, most platforms, the copyright will retain, whatever copyright exists in materials that users are posting will remain with those users, and the platforms will just have a license to display that content in some, or disseminate or transmit, or all the legalese that they need to cover themselves. Where this has implications is that in general, most research use of data, I think, will fall under fair dealing in Australia or fair use in other parts of the world. But where you may find it challenging is if you're looking at sharing data with other researchers. So you may have the right under copyright in your particular jurisdiction to collect material, to store that material and use it for the purposes of research, but you may not have the right to then share that material with anyone else, even if you would like to, because obviously sharing data is very important for things like reproducibility. I'm not a copyright lawyer, so I don't want to say any more about that, except you should probably be aware of what is going on in your jurisdiction. And you probably won't be able to widely share data you've collected online, particularly when you start talking about things like images and video. I think there's an open question whether short posts like tweets are copyrightable, which again, I'm not a lawyer, I can't answer that. Please don't ask me legal questions. I'll also mention personal safety because you need to consider this, particularly when you are doing things like hate speech or extremism or particularly inflammatory parts of the internet. And I say this because as a researcher, you probably have an internet presence, you probably have a footprint, and if you're not careful and you draw attention to yourself from the wrong groups, you may find that you have a personal safety issue. If a particular facet of, or I would say a white supremacist extremist group decides that they don't like you, that is a problem for you. That is a serious problem. That's something you should be actively planning for, depending on what the field of your research is. And that's, that's talking about more inflammatory, and that's just if you're talking about more inflammatory things. Even outside of those, you do need to be aware that your online footprint may identify you. Like if you post a selfie from your balcony with a skyline in the background, people can probably find where your apartment is. So you just need to be aware that you as a researcher using the internet, also have an online footprint, and that online footprint might reveal more than you'd like, and that may impact your personal safety. I hope that most people will never have to worry about this, but it is something that you need to keep in mind. And lastly, data management is a really tricky thing, particularly when we're talking about sensitive areas, when we're talking about copyright, when we're talking about good research practice. There's no obvious answers in most cases about what you should do for your data. In some cases, if you're dealing with particularly sensitive subject matter, the most appropriate data management technique might be to delete everything the moment you don't need it, which is obviously not great from a reproducibility perspective or the ability to share your work with others, but that may be what you need to do to protect the participants in your research data. Because when you collect granular internet data, you potentially have a lot of re-identifiable information. And this is particularly challenging when you think about the ability of users to control their presence their internet footprint by deleting or preventing material being shared more widely. So at the moment, a big chunk of the Australian Twitter sphere will contain tweets that have since been deleted, for example, and it's a pretty sizable fraction of them. They're just gone. They're not there anymore. The user decided, I don't want this public, I don't want this available, it's gone. Or they've deleted their whole account and everything they've ever posted is gone. So it's a real challenge and it's going to be specific to each project how you approach these things, but you do need to be prepared to actively manage your data. You need to know, well, is this sensitive? Do I need to keep it? Should I take steps to minimize it? Should I aggregate as early as possible so I don't have anything identifiable left, for example? And I mentioned context a few times because I think that's the other takeaway from this section is that the context matters. If your area of research is going to be things on the publicly available internet, so you don't need to log in to see them, and they're relatively innocuous topics and people aren't going to object or feel particularly concerned if you use their material, you probably don't need to think too hard about those things. But if you are looking at hate speech, for example, you need to, the steps and the levels and things you need to be prepared to do go up progressively as things get more complicated. So I'm not going to tell you need to do any particular thing. You know the context of your particular research projects. You know what you're interested in. You should also through your practice as a researcher, also have a good idea of what do the people on whose material you're interested in using actually think about this. What are their community norms, for example, that play into and impact how you conduct your research project? So far I've said like absolutely nothing technical. These are all just governance and questions. So if we're once you kind of navigate all of those things, or you have something in place or answers to all of those questions. So for example, in Australia, you might decide it's not a particularly sensitive area. You're going to use publicly available tweets. You have an ethics approval under a waiver of consent. You've got a data management plan. And you've ticked all the other boxes and made sure people can't find you on the internet if they don't like you and send a SWAT team your way. The next obvious question is, how do I actually collect data? So what I'm going to talk about is kind of a handful of the categories and types and ways we might consider collecting data from the web and from social media platforms. This is certainly not going to be an exhaustive list. I'm going to mention a couple of specific tools that might be useful for some really general purpose use cases. But I'm not going to give you recipes or dive down into the nuts and bolts of any specific thing. The first one I'm going to talk about is web archives, because I think these are very important and I think they're very underused for a lot of research purposes. Part of that is because they can be difficult to use. You need to know a lot and you need to bring together a lot of different pieces before you can actually turn a web archive into something usable for your specific project. So in terms of existing web archives, these are really interesting. So there is the Wayback Machine, which is part of the Internet Archive, which attempts to and manages to sorry, can you all hear me? I think I've lost my internet connection.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, it's just there's no cameras on and I've got an error on my win, so I'm just double checking I'm not talking into the void.
You did drop out for about 5 seconds.
Okay, sorry.
So it was definitely that. So
not for me actually.
Okay,
for me it did. That I heard that you got lost and I was like, oh, did we lose him? So, but in any case.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. I will share again.
It's lost, yeah.
Okay, Sam, how can we help?
No, I'm just going to share again. I'm just double checking that I'm not, there was no evidence of movement or anything. Okay, so you can all share my screen, okay? Or you can all see my screen, okay?
Yeah, I can. So
cool. So the Wayback Machine hosts, if you are lucky, the Wayback Machine may actually have really good coverage of something that's important to you. I was very lucky in a project recently. We were looking at YouTube's trending page, and the Wayback Machine just happened to have 2-hourly snapshots going back for 18 months of that particular page, which is exactly what that project needed. If you're unlucky, the Internet Archive may have nothing, so you're stuck in that case. I'll also point out that there are geographical specific web archives. So there are various national archives of sites hosted in particular locations. So I believe there's an Australian web archive and there's a few others around the world. So if you're interested in a specific geographical area, there may be a ready-made web archive just for you, which is perfect. The other thing I want people to consider is that you can also make your own web archives. All of the technical infrastructure that underpins the Internet Archive and other things, you can use some of that yourself. There are also some much more accessible things, like there is a browser, a browser plugin for Chrome, which is archiveweb.page, which will let you produce high fidelity archives of whatever you're seeing in your browser from within your browser. So it's super simple and low effort to get started if you have something of a particular niche or a specific, like you're only interested in a few pages or maybe one Facebook group, for example. The advantage of that approach is that if you can see it on the screen inside your browser, it will probably be captured by that web archiving approach, which can be a huge time saver instead of trying to do something like scraping, which I'll talk about a bit later. The second thing I want to mention, because I think this is also underrated, is donation or user-mediated approaches to studying particularly social media platforms. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about donation is sites like, for example, sites like Twitter and Facebook let you take a checkout or just literally say, Facebook, give me everything you have on me. This is partly motivated by things like GDPR, which require this functionality to be enabled by sites. And one approach to that is some libraries run data donation programs, which allow people to donate their social media data for research purposes. There are also things like the recently started Australian Search Experience Project, which is a browser plugin that runs searches on Google in your particular context on a schedule. So people sign up, they install the plugin will run a search every 4 hours around particular parameters of interest to the researchers. So people are basically donating their search results to that particular project. And I'll also mention so that qualitative researchers know or might be interested to know that there are also some approaches like the scrollback method and trace interviews, which use participants in interviews looking back through their social media history, for example, to get a richer, more situated view of what happened in the past. This is particularly in the case of like, how did people react to specific events? Did they have reactions? Were they doing particular things at a time? So I just wanted to mention that if you're of the qualitative bent, there are other ways to have users effectively donate their data to you or use it in the research that isn't you going to collect it without consent. Another option is APIs. So APIs as application programmer interfaces are ways for a platform to enable certain functionality to be accessible to developers and intentionally or unintentionally sometimes to researchers. In some cases, researchers use APIs that are intended for totally different purposes in ways that maybe the site didn't intend, but didn't realize it could be used in that way. The canonical example of this is the Twitter API, which I think is probably the main reason that Twitter is like the reference platform for social media research, is because the API is good enough for a lot of particular cases. It allows people to collect data in interesting ways and do interesting things. And with the new academic access, there are even more possibilities there. The constraints of this, though, is that you are depending on the platform or the website or whatever API you're accessing to actually provide something that's useful for you in that particular context, which may or may not happen, because often APIs are the primary use of APIs is things like, I want to build a bot that posts things on Discord, or I'm going to build a thing that interacts and draws together some other things. Most sites don't usually think of researchers and data access as a first-class use case. But if there is an API available, it may be useful for your research, and it may provide certain advantages for some types of data collection. And certainly if an API is available in some form, I would rule that out before exploring other options. As I briefly alluded to, scraping is also another option. I'm trying not to dive into the technical details, but I usually would encourage people not to scrape in the first instance. So when we're scraping, we're normally tightly coupling our understanding of how a website works, like the technical implementation, the HTML, the JavaScript, or how stuff gets onto the screen. To effectively scrape to collect data, you need to understand how that site works. You need to pick it apart in great detail. And then if you're trying to do a longitudinal project or something else, you need to then keep it up to date over time. There are a lot of ways to break scrapers. that are totally irrelevant to the site. Like a user doesn't care if a site changes the HTML, but that HTML change may break your scraper. So unless you have like a particular reason that you want to, for example, you want to avoid collecting particularly sensitive information, or you want to pre-aggregate or something, so you never have granular data, I would encourage people to think more about archiving first so that you can decouple data collection from data analysis. Because in general, archival approaches are less upfront work. You still need to do the analysis work, but you don't need to tie it directly to your collection. Which is kind of there's a hierarchy. Like if there's an API or an archival way to do something, I would prefer that to scraping, just because my experience is that's a lot less hassle. It's a lot easier to write a process to archive a site than it is to scrape a site in one hit. And if there is an API available, that's a good thing to explore before you do other things. That isn't to say you shouldn't use scraping. Just it wouldn't be where I started, with the exception of some very specific things, like, for example, if you're interested in video, the YouTube DL tool is basically a scraper specific to downloading video, and it works across a whole lot more sites now. Like it started with YouTube, but it's now just about every major platform that includes video, and that also includes functionality for things like collecting captions and stuff. So if you have a specific purpose, there may be a scraping tool that already satisfies your needs, and what everything I just said is irrelevant. So that's kind of the 30,000 foot view of data collection and the high level approaches. The actual, again, the specifics for your project are going to be different, and you are going to know your project. You may pick one or more, or maybe there's some other process that I forgot about and should have included in this. I'm not going to tell you how to conduct your research. I'm just going to suggest some possibilities or some starting points, and maybe some of the thinking that we try to consider when we're starting projects. So I just talked about data collection. Obviously, after you collect the data, you then need to do something with it, and that's usually the hardest part when it comes to web applications. So I'm going to talk about some of the high-level challenges. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, and I am kind of ignoring a lot of very fiddly technical problems that can come up, because I don't want to bog down this talk with that. They're a mechanical thing you need to do to get through a project. They're not necessarily like a blocker. So the first challenge, which I think a lot of people like to skip past, is that the web is like inherently complex. It's relational. So when we're talking about websites, we're talking about interlinked pages in the document model of the web. But also when we move into social media platforms, there's a lot of very complex things. There's no just page of tweets. It's tweets are posted by users. Tweets are posted by users in the context of a particular conversation. Those tweets can contain rich interactional data. So they might contain a hashtag to make their comment more findable. They might mention some other users to include them in the conversation. They might post a link to an external resource. So just because it's a single tweet, you can't ignore all of the complexity about that. For your particular project, you might decide to flatten or structure the research in some particular way so that you can answer your research question, but that might require a simplification of what is inherently a very, very rich medium. There is a lot that can happen on the web, and that's even before we get to the fact that the web is inherently supports, even on top of all the platform affordances and things and the structure of the web itself, the web supports rich media. So audio, video, images, memes, reusing memes, abusing memes, putting memes into really weird context in the context of a TikTok video, reusing some audio from somewhere else. The web is a very, very rich medium, and that can pose barriers to your analysis, because like if you're interested in video, that is a really, really hard space to work, because video is so complex. There's just so much happening in a single video, even if it's just a commentary YouTuber. There's still so much going on, and it's hard to tackle the complexity of that media. So you need to be prepared to dive deep sometimes. Longitudinal collections are also a particular challenge just because the web changes so much. Like, even if to you as a user, it doesn't look like a site is changing, I guarantee that a site is changing. In some cases, like particularly for bigger platforms, sometimes it's not even, there is no actual like canonical version of Twitter even through a web browser, because maybe every user has a different set of parameters. They're getting A/B tested, so they're seeing a slightly different view. There is not necessarily any place of stability or fixed things. If you want to do a longitudinal collection, you need to be prepared to keep on top of a lot of change and churn that may not even be in any way relevant to your research question. The next one is quantification, because that can be really difficult in and of itself. Like, how do you go from a bunch of posts on Reddit to numbers, or if even qualitative data has the same challenge? I should probably have included both of them here, because even things like, you can't assume that all, like if you perform a search on any platform, you almost can't assume that every account posting material matching a search is independent, because sometimes they're not. One person might have 20 sock puppet accounts all tweeting about the same or posting about the same thing. There's very limited demographic information, which I know the talk last week talked a bit about. That's always going to be a hard problem. The other thing also is that the beauty of the internet is it enables a particular kind of freedom. You have a lot more freedom in the way you represent yourself online. It's much easier to segment. You could, for example, segment your interests across different accounts or different platforms. So you might talk about a hobby on Reddit in one way with one particular persona, and you might talk about politics on Twitter, which is like the canonical example, with something different. And you might use different language, or you might have different approaches, or you might engage with communities in those different places in a different way. That's not and to be clear, this isn't a criticism. That's the wonderful thing about the web, is that it allows that particular type of freedom. But as a researcher, that can make it really difficult to, like, what am I looking at? How do I measure this? There's no like hard and fast way to do it. And even if you do things like you aggregate, like you count the number of posts containing a keyword, that's one measure, but that's only the platform's view of it. It may not actually be relevant to your research question. And I guess the last two I have is that working across platforms and generalization are both, I think, really difficult challenges. I don't know if you can necessarily say a lot about society if you just study a particular Facebook group. And I mean, maybe you don't need to say that in your particular thing, but I think we need to be careful about, I think we should be guarded in drawing society-wide inference from specific pockets of social media, because we are never, ever going to see an entire platform, even an entire platform, let alone all of the platforms. Facebook has more than a billion monthly users. There is no way to distill that down into some neat society-wide knowledge. We need to be very careful about how broadly I think we need to carefully contextualize whenever we're working with web data. Like, how far can we actually go with it? I'm not suggesting that there is any way, like, I don't think I have good answers for this. I don't think anybody does. I think it's just a limitation we need to keep in mind. And I will add one more that occurred to me just before I started this talk and didn't want to try and squeeze in. I think the other challenge in this space is that it really does require multidisciplinary work. And I'm not just talking like technical and research, but I think understanding the web and using the web in your research, I think it is best if we can to bring as many different perspectives as you are able. Because, like, I think, for example, communications researchers have a lot to say and a lot to bring to the table. I think linguists have an enormous amount to bring to the table and probably should be talked to more. I think everybody has something, and I don't think the web can ever belong to a single field of study. I think we need to be prepared to work across groups and across disciplines as much as possible. So to kind of wrap up my opinions, let's call them that, opinions. I'm not going to suggest that anybody needs to conduct their research in any particular way. I will remind you that you know your research, you know your field, you will know the people you are researching, you will know the content and the communities you're researching. That context is always critical and you can never ignore it. There is no single right answer that will work in every situation. So as long as you keep that context in mind, I think it would be great if everybody could continue to keep that context in mind. And I'd also, like I said at the start, I don't think anybody questions the importance of the internet. And I think the kind of addendum to that is that means that the internet is a very important space to research, even if it is challenging. And the web is an important place to research, even if it is challenging, even if it is hard. Even if Facebook says we shouldn't, we probably should study Facebook a lot. And that's not even mentioning all the other platforms, both dominant and emerging. So thank you for listening to my opinions. I hope that wasn't too much of a rant. You can find us here. Okay,